I studied the entire series, and when I was done, I watched the show again, and I couldn't believe it. It was like I understood everything. Is it possible to do a demo for even 2 minutes? Sure, why not? This was a comment on a recent video of mine where I break down my 7-step formula to learn languages, and I've also been getting a lot of the same questions, so I figured it would be a perfect chance to show what I'm doing and to answer a lot of questions. So the main goal of this 7-step formula is to learn from native content. And it could be tricky to find native content, like this user asks. Marlilar. That is hard to pronounce. Marlilar. How do you find content to listen to in your target language? Now, the best case is to watch native content, but sometimes it can be tricky. So a surefire way to find content in your target language is to look up graded readers with audio. So for example, I just started learning Chinese recently. If I jumped right into native content, it would exhaust me because there would just be too much that I don't know. So I looked up graded readers, and I wanted to make sure that it had audio with it. So I found this website called Mandarin Bean that has a bunch of mini stories that allow you to read, listen, and use that as study practice. So step number 1, watch media with captions in your native language. Mandarin Bean doesn't come with English translation, so I just take the text and put it into Google Translate so I could read it while I'm listening to it for the first time. And because these are like short, 1 minute in length, it doesn't take that long to go through step 2 as well. Watch the same content with no captions. I mean, I literally just sit there, just close my eyes and just listen to it for a moment. And after that, I go right into step number 3. Listen and write what you hear with no captions. So when I'm doing this, I have the goal of trying to listen to every single detail possible, and then I write it down. And sometimes it takes a while to do. Yesterday when I was doing this, it took me about 45 minutes to go through steps 1 through 3. So as you can see here, I'm doing this with Chinese, but I'm not writing down the Chinese characters. I'm writing down the pronunciation. It's one less thing to worry about. I can just focus on listening rather than trying to remember a new writing system. And for example, when I was doing this with Japanese, I did write it in hiragana because it's fairly easy to learn and it connects one-to-one with how those sounds actually connect with the language. So it gave me good practice with something that wasn't that difficult. And as you can see, while I'm writing, I leave an extra line. That way I can go back and write the correct pronunciation. This gives me a great way to practice and make sure I'm learning what is correct. And here's another question from Edwin Flores. So step 2 and 3 don't connect, right? You watch the video again with no captions, and then a third time with no captions and note-taking? Or does step 2 go in with step 3? Just making sure here? Haha, thank you. So yes, if you follow the steps exactly, they don't connect. That said, don't feel like you have to follow everything exactly as I laid it out, because I didn't even follow it exactly every single time. Sometimes when I knew I wanted to study from something, I'd skip right over 2 and go right into 3. It doesn't matter. The steps are there as like a framework, and you could mix and match them however you want. And we have another question from Mary Ling. Media can be songs as long as I have captions, right? Yes, anything you use will be great practice, but there is one thing to remember. There is a difference between music and normal spoken language. Sometimes music comes with words that you might not use, different grammar just to make it flow better with the song. So it's not an exact match to what's used in just normal speech. And as long as you know that, it's a great way to just practice the flow and vocabulary of the language. And this leads into step number 4. Listen, read, write, and speak with captions in your target language. So just real quick, here's a clip from my previous video that explains how this practice is done. Step number 1, listen to the phrase while reading the captions. Step number 2, look up any unknown words or any unknown grammar. Step number 3, speak the phrase aloud. Step number 4, handwrite the phrase by copying the captions. Step number 5, repeat this with the same phrase for a total of 3 times. So as I go through this, I play a part of the audio and read what's written.
我的朋友说，这里的广东菜很好吃。
Then I try speaking it back to myself, and sometimes I just do this in my head if I don't feel like speaking aloud. That's fine. And then I write down the exact Chinese from the content. Then after I write the English meaning just to build that connection. That way I have something new that I don't know about, and I have the English that I do know, and I start connecting those two together. Now, I do have two questions here about this. Does this work with languages that have nothing or very little in common with your own language? And thanks for this video, but does the one where you write 3 times work with A1 learners? So yes, as you can tell, I'm doing this with Chinese, which is a language that's very different than my own language. I actually think it works better in languages that are very different because every single thing that you do feels like you're learning something. So every single written character that I do, like, oh, it feels nice to write. When I try to do this with Spanish, I can't really do it as well because, I don't know, I feel like I get more bored more easily. So yes, it's great for languages that aren't similar to your own. If anything, I think it works better. And this also does work for A1 learners, which is very beginner level. Because with Chinese, I literally just started it this year. Now, I do have a bit of an edge because I learned Japanese in the past that uses kanji, which is basically Chinese characters. So I do have an edge in that, but you could definitely still do it as an A1 learner because I had the time where I was doing it with Japanese as an A1 learner. So it's definitely doable. But for A1 learners, I definitely recommend starting with the graded readers like I'm showing in this video. So this method does take a lot of time because you're writing the same phrase over and over. And, well, it could be tedious, like this one comment says. So how long did it take you to learn a language this way? It seems very tedious indeed. Did you have to watch one episode several times? So yes, it does take a lot of time. When I was doing it with just a minute of content with Chinese, it took me about 50 minutes to go through the whole thing. But I don't really see it as tedious because I look at it in a different way. I view it more as a meditative process. I'm not trying to force myself to remember everything that I write. I'm mainly just spending time with the language. So as I'm writing, sometimes my mind just wanders, and that's okay. You don't have to force yourself to learn everything. Now, there are some time-saving tricks that I use. For example, while I'm writing the English, sometimes I abbreviate words to make it easier to write. And then in cases where there's similar phrases written back to back, I'm not going to write them all 3 times over. I would probably just, depending on how many phrases there are, I would just write them all once or maybe twice. And here are some other questions. Basically, these are asking, how do you know if the captions are a one-to-one match with the content? Now, this one has to do more with watching native content. If you go with the graded reader style that I've been showing in this video, those are generally going to be one-to-one match. Now, if you're watching native content, it's going to be a hit or miss. Even on places like Netflix, they're not perfect one-to-one matches. And this does make it trickier, but generally speaking, as you're practicing, as you're increasing your listening skill, you're going to be able to pick up on these differences and know where the captions go wrong. And in those cases where the captions are wrong, you could kind of just skip over those parts if you don't know exactly the words that are being used. But generally speaking, you want to practice with the audio that's there. So if you do know the words, you can still write them down, but you don't have to. You can skip over them if you want. Now for step 5, clip audio for review. So this one I'm not doing just yet with Chinese, but I'm doing it with Spanish. So I've been using my own web app called mizas.com, where I'm finding content in Spanish to watch and also be able to clip audio from those videos. Now, the audio clipping is a desktop-only feature right now, but allows me to clip audio and create review cards from that dialogue. Right now, a lot of my clips are coming from the public database that I have, where you could search for a word and find a ton of different example sentences in the language you're learning. Now, the only reason why I'm not doing this with Chinese right now is because it's still in beta, and right now, some of these features don't really work well with other languages. I'm working on fixing up Chinese so you could use it with that language as well. And on to step number 6, practice native pronunciation. This one is also one that I'm doing mostly with Spanish right now, where I take those audio clips that I had from the previous step and I could bring them into Mimic Review, where I can listen to the audio clip and practice speaking it back myself. And step number 7, sit and enjoy. So this one's pretty straightforward. For me, after I go through the content from Mandarin Bean, I just sit back, listen to it, and take in everything that I have been studying throughout that period of time. And it makes a big difference from before and after when you listen to it. Now I do have several of the same questions right here. These are basically asking, do you follow all of the 7 steps after every single episode, or do you follow it after you've finished the entire season? So what I usually do with this, if it's linear storytelling, I would probably just watch the entire series just so I could enjoy it first, and then go back and go through the steps. If every episode is its own contained story, I might just go episode by episode. So for example, with the Mandarin Bean stuff, like every single lesson is its own contained thing. So I just go through each lesson individually. And really, you could do whatever you feel like. This isn't a hard set rule. For example, if you're watching a linear story and you just feel like you want to spend as much time with it as possible before you get to the end, you could go episode by episode if you want. Don't feel like you have to follow an exact formula. Like I call it my 7-step formula, but really it's more of a guideline than hard set rules.
The code is more what you'd call guidelines than actual rules.
And I do have one other question that asks, should I do all the steps in one study session or break it up over a few days? Is it still effective? So yes, definitely. If anything, it's more effective if you break it up over a few days. Now, with small clips like I'm using with Mandarin Bean, where it's basically a minute in length, I do go through all of the steps in a day because I can. But if you're watching native content, especially with shows where it's like 20 minutes or more per episode, you're going to want, like, it's going to be impossible to try to jam it into one day unless you are studying full time like it's your job. So that shows my entire process and answers most of the repeating questions. If you have any other questions for me, you could comment those down below. And if you haven't watched my 7-step formula video yet, you could go watch that right there. And if you want to watch any of my other videos, I'll link those there as well. And with all that said, I'll see you in the next video.